The blood had not yet soaked into the ground, and the spring ice had not yet melted from the rocks of the northern camps. On the morning of March 20th, 235 legionnaires found bodies by the Rhine River. Emperor Gaius Alexander Severus and his mother, Julia Mamaea, had been hacked to death by their own soldiers. Thus began one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Roman Empire. Not at a Senate meeting, not with the scratching of pens in the Capitol, but on an icy parade ground, among rough tents and drunken shouts. The boy emperor, who had ruled since his teenage years, fell not at the hands of barbarians, but by order of another Roman, Caius Julius Verus Maximinus, the son of a Thracian shepherd and an Allan woman, who did not know Latin until he was an adult and wore a toga for the first time on the day he was proclaimed emperor. In textbooks, this event is presented as part of the crisis of the 3rd century, an allegedly natural decline, a succession of weak emperors and pressure from the barbarians. But if you look at the details, it becomes clear that it was on this day, on this night, that Rome finally ceased to be the world of the Romans. Official chronicles mark the year 235 as the beginning of political instability. Senators spoke of a breach of tradition, historians of a crisis. But in reality, Rome recognized for the first time the authority of a man who was not only foreign by origin, but also hostile to everything that was considered the essence of the empire. Caius Julius Verus Maximinus came from the northern outskirts, from a poor family of Thracian nomads. He did not receive a classical education, did not serve in the capital's guard, and had no connections in the Senate. However, from his youth, he was known for his superhuman strength. According to his contemporaries, he could break horseshoes with his bare hands and eat for 3. His service began in the lower ranks, but in years of instability, military prowess meant more than pedigree. This was especially true among the legionnaires in the border provinces, who were exhausted, deprived, and despised by the capital. They wanted a leader who was like them, rough, decisive, one of their own, and they got him. How did the rebellion happen? According to surviving court records and field reports, Alexander Severus and his mother were in a German camp near Mainz. He delayed the start of the campaign, preferring negotiations and payments to enemies, which irritated the officers. Julia Mamaea, who had previously kept her son under strict control, was losing her authority during those days. Proclamations began to be intercepted and orders ignored. Maximinus seized the moment. His supporters spread a rumor that the emperor intended to leave the army, taking the treasury with him. On the night of March 19th, 20, a group of legionnaires broke into the tent. According to one version, Alexander tried to hide behind his mother, and both were killed at the same time. There was no funeral or tombstone. The bodies were taken away at night and burned in the forest. The Senate in Rome was faced with a fait accompli. In the north stood the legions. Behind Maximinus stood the army, and against him stood only the memory of the old norms. For the first time in the history of the empire, power was given to a figure who not only did not have the title of senator, but also had no access to Roman circles at all. Not a citizen, a warrior, not educated in philosophy, educated in blood, he was officially recognized, but many historians, including Herodian, wrote about him with horror, a monster in human form, and this image quickly began to be confirmed. In subsequent campaigns, Maximinus burned German villages, executed people without trial, and imposed taxes on everything in the cities, from bread to funerals. He paid special attention to his son, Gaius Julius Verus Maximus. According to the soldiers' recollections, the young man was with his father everywhere, even in his campaign tents. They said of him, "He is his father's eyes." Some sources claim that Maximinus was preparing his son to be the direct successor to the dynasty, creating something like a military monarchy for the first time. At the same time, the boy had neither a Roman education nor a metropolitan upbringing. only training barracks life and his father's orders. Already in the first months of his reign, people said, "This young man will become the executioner of the Senate." Cautious complaints appear in the correspondence of the governors of Africa and Asia. The new government does not consider it necessary to consult, only to demand. One of the legates in Baetica called what was happening the rebirth of Rome into fury. And what about Julia Mamaea, whose figure had long been an invisible shield for Alexander? Historians disagree. Some say that she fell victim to ambition, others that she believed until the very end that she could dissuade the soldiers from betrayal. But the fact remains, with her death, the last thread between the cultural east of the empire and its rough military periphery disappeared. Mamaea came from a noble Syrian family and patronized science, philosophy, and temples. Her murder was not only a political but also a symbolic breakdown, a rejection of refinement in favor of force. Thus, two phenomena coincided: the structural crisis of the empire and the personal choice of the commander. Maximinus did not simply kill the emperor, he called into question the very idea of Romanity. He proved that the state now belonged not to the Senate or tradition, but to the one who wielded the sword and gathered the legions. This was not a temporary disruption. It was the birth of a new logic. And if you are interested in the twists and turns of history, where one night changes an entire era, subscribe and stay with us. Next, we will see how Maximinus became not just a despot, but also the creator of a monstrous legacy, at the center of which was his own son. Few Roman emperors began their journey as unusually as Caius Julius Verus Maximinus. His origins did not fit into the usual framework of the elite. He was born around 173 AD in remote Thrace, on the border of the empire, to a Gothic shepherd and a woman from the Alan tribe. These roots did not promise him a bright future in Rome, where power was traditionally passed down through noble families and senatorial families. Maximinus had no chance of entering the Senate, so his path to the heights of power began at the very bottom. He joined the army as a private soldier. However, his military career turned out to be unusually rapid and bloody. Between 1208 and 1214, he became famous in campaigns in Britain and Upper Germania for his exceptional cruelty and ruthlessness, which was noted by contemporary chroniclers. His name inspired fear even in his allies and terror in his enemies. After the death of Praetor Flavius in 1234, Maximinus gained the support of the legions on the Danube and power over the troops guarding the border. In March 1235, at the fortress of Novae on the Rhine, he led a rebellion that led to the overthrow of Alexander Severus and his mother Julia Mamaea, who were executed on his orders. Despite Maximinus's lack of senatorial diplomas and public promises to restore traditional foundations, the Roman Senate officially recognized him as emperor on March 25th of the same year. This recognition was a real test for the Roman elite, who saw him as a stranger and a barbarian who did not fit the ideals of Roman power. The question of the legitimacy of his throne remained open. Could a man of such origin and without a traditional education become a true ruler of Rome? However, Maximinus proved that his strength lay not in his origin, but in his will and ruthlessness. He transformed from a barbarian military leader into a devoted father and emperor who sought to pass power on to his son in order to lay the foundations for a new dynasty. His rise to power became a symbol of change in the Roman Empire, where old traditions were increasingly giving way to strength and determination, and ancestry was no longer the main criterion for power. Incredibly, Caius Julius Verus Maximinus, the future emperor of Rome, began his journey not in the golden halls of palaces, but among the pastures of the wild lands of Thrace, where he was born around 173 AD. His father was a simple Gothic shepherd, and his mother was a woman from the Allan people, which made Maximinus's origins unusual and far from noble by Roman standards. At that time, the Roman elite strictly valued pedigree and senatorial origins, and Maximinus had neither of these attributes. He was not born into a noble family, did not receive an education at the best schools in Rome, and did not have access to the upper echelons of society. This circumstance could have been an insurmountable obstacle, but Maximinus chose a different path, that of a warrior. Enlisting in the army as a private, he showed unprecedented cruelty and determination in military campaigns in the north of the empire, especially in Britain and the Upper German province, between 208 and 214. His contemporaries noted his severity and uncompromising nature, which did not always please even Roman officers, but it was these qualities that made him famous and respected among soldiers. After the death of Praetor Flavius in 1234, Maximinus gained the support of the Danube legions, which allowed him to take control of the troops on the border of the empire. In March 1235, at the fortress of Novae on the Rhine, he led a rebellion that led to the execution of Emperor Alexander Severus and his mother Julia Mamaea. This dramatic turn of events led to the Roman Senate, despite Maximinus's lack of senatorial credentials and promises to restore old traditions, officially recognizing him as emperor on March 25th of that year. The legitimacy of his power was questioned by many members of the Roman aristocracy, as Maximinus was a stranger and a military leader whose power was based on the support of the army rather than on hereditary rights or political intrigues. Nevertheless, he managed not only to hold on to the throne, but also to set himself the goal of creating a new dynasty by passing power on to his son. This ambitious plan was unusual for Roman tradition, where power often passed through complex political agreements and senatorial decisions. Maximinus, in essence, built his power on strength and will, on strict control over the army and unyielding determination. His reign became a symbol of the changes that were gradually sweeping the Roman Empire. Old foundations and traditions were increasingly giving way to new forms of power, where ancestry lost its significance in the face of strength and the ability to govern the state. Maximinus proved that true power lay not in noble blood, but in personal strength of character, military might, and perseverance. His journey from shepherd to emperor became legendary, and the image of an obsessed father striving to secure a future for his son went down in history as an example of how new realities were changing the face of Rome and its rulers. However, Maximinus proved that his strength lay not in his ancestry, but in his will and ruthlessness. He transformed himself from a barbarian military leader into an obsessed father and emperor, who sought to transfer power to his son in order to lay the foundations for a new dynasty. His rise became a symbol of change in the Roman Empire, where old traditions were increasingly giving way to strength and determination, and ancestry was no longer the main criterion for power. In 1236, Maximinus Thrax took an important step that forever changed the fate of his family and the empire. He proclaimed his 18-year-old son, Gaius Julius Verus Maximus, Caesar and heir to the throne. This act was not just a formality, but the beginning of a new era in the relationship between father and son, where care gradually turned into something more tense and anxious. Maximinus, accustomed to constant threats and intrigues, decided to protect the heir from any possible dangers. But his methods raised more and more questions and concerns among his contemporaries. He dismissed all male tutors from the court, replacing them exclusively with women from his personal harem, a decision that surprised and alarmed the courtiers, as Maximinus was thus limiting the influence of traditional mentors and strengthening his control over his son's upbringing. Moreover, senators and praetorians were strictly restricted from accessing Maximus under the pretext of ensuring the heir's safety, which created an atmosphere of isolation and distrust around the young Caesar. His father paid particular attention even to his son's appearance. For the first time in the history of the court, there were mentions of bright tunics and expensive silk, which Maximinus insisted Maximus wear, emphasizing his status and exclusivity. However, these measures not only protected him, but also became a tool of pressure. Those who expressed doubts about the emperor's behavior or decisions were subjected to public intimidation and corporal punishment, which intensified the atmosphere of fear and tension around the family. Gradually, concern for the safety and future of the heir grew into a form of psychological control and violence, with the father becoming increasingly obsessed with protecting Maximus from any threats, real or imagined. The question of when exactly this concern became pathological remains open, but it is clear that Maximinus was prepared to go to extreme lengths to protect his son from the conspiracies and intrigues that, in his opinion, surrounded them on all sides. This obsession not only changed the nature of relationships within the family, but also influenced the political life of the empire, where fear and suspicion became an integral part of everyday life. Maximinus, as if imprisoning Maximus in a golden cage, created a world around him where every step and every word was controlled, and any display of independence was perceived as a potential threat. This contradictory alliance between father and son was characterized not only by love and care, but also by deep mistrust, which would soon lead to new trials and dramas in the fate of the Roman Empire. In 1236, Maximinus Trajan appointed his son Gaius Julius Verus, Maximus as Caesar, and heir to the throne, which was not just a formal act of transferring power, but the beginning of a new troubled chapter in their relationship. Maximus, barely 18 years old, found himself under the close and almost painful attention of his father, whose concern gradually grew into obsession. Maximinus, seeking to secure the future of the empire and his son, decided to radically change the young heir's environment. He dismissed all male teachers and mentors, replacing them exclusively with women from his own harem, which was an unusual and disturbing innovation. Contemporaries noted that this decision was dictated not only by the desire to protect Maximus from harmful influences, but also by the desire to control every aspect of his upbringing, excluding any male authority figures who could exert independent influence on him. Moreover, Maximinus restricted access to his heir for senators and praetorians, officially explaining this as a necessity to ensure Maximus's safety, but in reality, it looked like an attempt to isolate his son from political intrigues and possible conspiracies. An atmosphere of suspicion and tension arose around the young Caesar. He was guarded not only by bodyguards, but also by carefully selected courtiers who obeyed his father's strict instructions. Particular attention was paid to Maximus's appearance. For the first time in the history of the court, there were mentions of the bright tunics and expensive silk he wore, which emphasized his status and at the same time became a symbol of exclusivity and vulnerability. Any deviation from the prescribed norms and rules provoked Maximin's anger, and he did not hesitate to publicly punish those who dared to doubt the abilities or safety of the heir. Corporal punishment and intimidation became a common tool for maintaining order around Maximus, which only intensified the atmosphere of fear and tension. Soon, his father's concern turned into a form of psychological abuse, where love was intertwined with control and distrust, and the son became a hostage to his father's own fears. Maximinus saw enemies and conspirators around him, ready at any moment to take Maxim's life and inheritance, and so the heir's every move was carefully controlled, and any display of independence was perceived as a potential threat. This obsession not only changed the nature of relationships within the family, but also influenced the political life of the empire, where fear and suspicion became an integral part of everyday life. Maximin, as if imprisoning Maximus in a golden cage, created a world around him where every step and every word was controlled, and any display of independence was perceived as a potential threat. This contradictory alliance between father and son manifested not only love and care, but also deep mistrust, which would soon lead to new trials and dramas in the fate of the Roman Empire. In the history of the Roman Empire, there were few such unusual and at the same time disturbing cases when power became an instrument for the radical transformation of the personality of the heir to the throne. At the court of Emperor Maximinus, just such an event took place. His son and heir, Maximus, was subjected to forced feminization, which turned into something more than just an external transformation. The emperor issued a strict decree requiring the young man to wear a stola, a ceremonial women's garment woven from purple and gold silk, traditionally intended for the most high-ranking women of the court. This outfit, called stola nucilia, symbolized not only status, but also a transition to a completely new social role that contradicted the heir's biological sex. To perfect the transformation, the best court cosmetologists were invited, masters of their craft who were engaged in hair removal, applying makeup, and creating complex hairstyles. Artificial wigs made from hair brought from Germanic lands were used for hairstyles, which gave the image a special exoticism and emphasized status. Daily preparation took up to 5 hours, and Maximin personally ensured that all signs of masculinity were removed from his son's skin and hair, not the slightest hint of manliness. Contemporaries noted in their memoirs that this process was not just meticulous, but almost ritualistic, transforming the young man into the living embodiment of a feminine image imposed from above. Moreover, the way Maxime was addressed by those around him changed. He was called exclusively by feminine nicknames, Beautiful Maxima and My Dear Daughter, which emphasized the new identity imposed on the heir. The chronicles of that time preserve evidence that such treatment was not only a formality, but also part of a political game aimed at strengthening the emperor's power through control over the heir and replacing his role in society. This whole transformation became not just a personal ordeal for Maximus, but also a powerful tool of political pressure, a demonstration of the power and control that Maximinus wanted to establish in the empire. However, the question that concerned everyone around him was how far this experiment with identity would go, and what would happen when the emperor decided to cement his son's new role with an official marriage ceremony, turning this symbolic transition into a legal and social act. This event promised to be not only a new stage in the life of the heir, but also an important turning point for the entire empire, where personality and power were intertwined in the most unexpected way. No one expected Emperor Maximinus to so radically change his son's destiny, turning the process of upbringing into a carefully thought-out political action. The order for his son to wear a stola and a stola nucalia, a ceremonial garment for women made of purple and gold silk, was the first and most noticeable step in this unusual transformation. According to court records, these outfits were not only beautiful, but also symbolic. Purple was always associated with power and high status, while gold silk emphasized the heir's exceptional position. However, clothing was only an external expression of the profound transformation that Maximinus had in mind for his son. In order to erase his masculine features as much as possible, the emperor hired the best cosmetologists and hairdressers in the empire, renowned for their skill in the art of hair removal, makeup, and creating the most intricate hairstyles. Official documents show that hair from Germanic lands was used to make wigs. It was famous for its thickness and shine, which made Maximus's image even more impressive and unusual. Daily preparation took up to 5 hours. Every hair, every detail of the makeup was carefully checked to completely hide any hint of masculinity. Contemporaries described in their memoirs how Maxime patiently and even with a certain pride watched this process, seeing in it not only the personal transformation of his son, but also a symbol of a new era in which power and identity were intertwined in the most unexpected way. An atmosphere of exclusivity and even mysticism developed around the heir. Courtiers addressed him exclusively with feminine nicknames, "Beautiful Maxima" and "My dear daughter." Chronicles of the time record how this unusual form of address caused a mixture of surprise, confusion, and even fear among those around him. For many, this was not just an innovation, but a challenge to traditional values and ideas about the roles of men and women in society. Maximin himself seemed to see this not only as a way to control his son's fate, but also as a powerful political move, demonstrating his absolute power over the personality and destiny of even his closest relative. This transformation became not only a test for Maximus, but also a tool to pressure courtiers and political opponents, forcing them to accept a new reality where a person's identity could be replaced and rewritten at the emperor's will. However, the most important and alarming question remained. What would happen when Maximinus decided to legitimize his son's new role with a marriage ceremony? No one in Rome expected that the events of March 15, 1238, would become a symbol not only of madness, but also of ruthless power. On that day, within the walls of the Senate, Maximinus, the emperor renowned for his cruelty and extravagance, announced his marriage to Caesar Maximus, his son and heir. But this was no ordinary marriage. Maximus appeared before the assembly dressed as a bride, wearing a stola nuncialia, the traditional dress for Roman brides, with a veil and jewelry, which, according to the senators, looked like a mockery of the sacred customs of the Romans. The senators, accustomed to strict rituals and respect for the law, were stunned. But only one of them, Cornelius Balbus, decided to protest. He called this union an encroachment on divine and human laws, emphasizing that the emperor was violating not only traditions, but also the very essence of Roman morality. His words angered Maximinus, who, without hesitation, personally strangled Balbus in the assembly hall, demonstrating his absolute power and unshakable authority to everyone. This was followed by an oppressive silence, filled with fear and helplessness. The senators understood that it was now impossible to oppose the emperor, and even the boldest ideas of resistance seemed hopeless. The wedding ceremony scheduled for the next day took place without the traditional purification rituals, which were considered mandatory and sacred for such an event. This caused outrage among priests and believers, who saw it as blasphemy and an insult to the gods. The ceremony, deprived of sacred blessing, became a symbol of the destruction of Rome's centuries-old foundations and showed how far the emperor could go in violating laws and rituals for his own will. The question that now troubled everyone was how the legions and provinces would react to this act, which destroyed Roman traditions and order. After all, if the emperor's power exceeded the limits of what was permissible, what would remain of Rome as a state and society? This event was a turning point that foreshadowed not only internal upheavals, but also the possible weakening of the empire, when fear and lawlessness began to rule instead of law and honor. On that memorable day, March 15, 1238, the walls of the Roman Senate witnessed an event that shook the foundations of the empire and caused a wave of bewilderment and horror among the noble patricians. Maximinus, an emperor with an iron will and unlimited power, decided on an act that no one could have foreseen. He announced his marriage to his own son, Caesar Maximus. But this was not just a political union, but a symbolic ritual in which the sun appeared before the assembly in the guise of a bride. In traditional stole Nucilia, with a veil covering her head in jewels, which, according to contemporaries, looked like a mockery of ancient customs and laws. The senators, accustomed to strict rituals and respect for tradition, were shocked. One of the most influential, Cornelius Balbus, dared to protest, calling the marriage an encroachment on divine and human laws, a violation that threatened the very essence of Rome. His words, full of anger and despair, sounded like the last voice of reason in the hall, where a tense silence reigned. The emperor's response was swift and merciless. He ordered Balbus to be strangled on the spot, demonstrating that no laws or traditions could stand in the way of his will. After that, a heavy silence fell over the Senate, reflecting the fear and powerlessness in the face of the tyranny that had seized power at the heart of the empire. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for the next day, but without the usual rituals of purification and blessing by the gods, which, according to the religious writings of the time, was considered blasphemy and caused outrage among the priests and the people. This act violated not only the laws, but also the sacred bond between state and religion, undermining the foundations on which the Roman Empire was built. Senators and priests understood that if the emperor was capable of so openly disregarding tradition, nothing could stop him from further destroying the rule of law. The question that now troubled everyone was how the legions and provinces would react to this act, which destroyed Roman traditions and order. After all, if the emperor's power exceeded the limits of what was permissible, what would remain of Rome as a state and society? This event was a turning point that foreshadowed not only internal upheavals, but also the possible weakening of the empire, when fear and lawlessness began to rule instead of law and honor. No one in the history of Rome could have imagined that the emperor would take such a step, to announce his marriage to his own son. On March 15, 1238, within the walls of the Senate, Maximinus the Great uttered words that shocked everyone present. He announced his marriage to Caesar Maximus. Caesar, dressed in traditional wedding attire, a stola nuncialia, with a veil on his head and jewelry made of precious stones, looked like a bride, which in itself was a flagrant violation of Roman customs and laws. The senators, accustomed to strict rituals and traditions, were stunned by this spectacle. The sudden and widespread rejection of the emperor's authority spread not only to the capital, but also to the most remote corners of the empire, where traditions and laws seemed inviolable. In Spain, Governor Marcus Clodius Pupienus, a man accustomed to strict discipline and respect for authority, unexpectedly made a public refusal to recognize the new emperor. He called on his subjects and colleagues to be guided by divine and human laws, emphasizing that the legitimacy of power cannot be based on violence and the violation of sacred norms. His words spread throughout the province, causing a wave of discontent and doubts about the usurper's right to rule the empire. At the same time, the situation in Gaul was becoming even more tense. The legions, which for centuries had been the bastion of Roman power and honor, began to refuse to swear allegiance to the new ruler. Military reports indicated that the soldiers considered it impossible to serve under a man who, in their opinion, had violated his manly duty and betrayed the ideals of Roman valor. The troops, accustomed to strict order and discipline, were now on the verge of open rebellion, which threatened catastrophic consequences for the entire empire. At the same time, in Rome, the College of Pontiffs, the highest priestly body, convened an emergency meeting and issued a resounding decision. The marriage ritual performed by the emperor was deemed a desecration of the temples of Venus and Rome. The clergy, guardians of spiritual traditions, perceived the ruler's actions as a violation of sacred rites and moral foundations, which further undermined his authority in the eyes of the population and the nobility. Senators, realizing the threat to the stability of the state, secretly gathered to discuss possible measures to remove the emperor. Their records and the testimonies of court circles show that the Roman elite was ready to take decisive action to restore order and legality. This whole chain of events created a deep rift in society, tearing apart the unity of the empire and calling into question the very legitimacy of power. The army, the priesthood, and the provincial authorities found themselves on different sides of the conflict, and it seemed that the spark capable of igniting an open rebellion was already smoldering in the hearts of the discontented. The question remained open: who and how would be able to restore lost trust and return respect to the emperor, without which it would be impossible to preserve the empire? It was this uncertainty and tension that heralded coming changes and new trials for Rome. The sudden and decisive action of the governor of Spain, Marcus Clodius Pupienus, shook the entire empire. He publicly refused to recognize the emperor, stating that he had violated not only human but also divine laws, which every ruler must follow. These words, recorded in provincial chronicles, quickly spread throughout Spain and beyond, causing a wave of discontent among local residents and officials. At the same time, the situation in Gaul was becoming even more tense. The legions, traditionally loyal to the emperor, began to refuse to swear allegiance to the new ruler, considering him a usurper who had betrayed the duty and honor of military service. Military reports indicated growing discontent among soldiers, many of whom openly expressed doubts about the legitimacy of the new regime, fearing that their loyalty could turn into a betrayal of the ideals and traditions of Rome. In Rome, at the heart of the empire, the College of Pontiffs convened an emergency meeting where the priesthood unanimously declared the emperor's marriage ritual an insult to sacred rites and a desecration of the temples of Venus and Rome. These religious acts, carefully documented in church archives, testified to a deep schism in the spiritual sphere that undermined the foundations of state legitimacy. Senators, alarmed by what was happening, began to hold secret meetings, discussing the possibility of removing the emperor and restoring order to the capital. Records from court circles reflected the anxiety and uncertainty that prevailed among the upper echelons of society, where many already doubted the future of power and stability. The army, the priesthood, and the provincial authorities found themselves on different sides of the conflict, and it seemed that the spark capable of igniting an open rebellion was already smoldering in the hearts of the discontented. The question remained open: who and how would be able to restore lost trust and return respect to the emperor, without which it would be impossible to preserve the empire? It was this uncertainty and tension that heralded the coming changes and new trials for Rome.